The county courthouse had seen its share of cases, land disputes, financial quarrels, petty theft, and the occasional violent crime. But there was something about custody battles that always seemed to weigh heavier in the air. On this Tuesday morning, the air inside Courtroom 3 felt especially thick, as if every breath had to push through walls of unspoken tension. The high ceilings and heavy oak benches only amplified the silence between words, turning whispers into echoes and footsteps into thunder. Families, neighbors, and reporters filled the gallery, their faces tight with expectation. Some came because they knew the families involved. Others came because they had heard rumors about abuse, secrets, and the possibility of a child being pulled from unsafe hands. But for the lawyers, jurors, and the judge, this was more than gossip. It was a responsibility that could alter a child's life forever. At the front, Judge Helen Carrington adjusted her glasses and scanned the room. She was a woman seasoned by decades on the bench, known for her calm authority and piercing ability to cut through emotional theatrics. She sat elevated above the courtroom, gavel within reach, a symbol of order in a place where chaos often tried to spill through. Yet even she felt a peculiar weight in the room today, a subtle prickling sense that this case would not be ordinary. The attorneys were already in place. On the left, the mother's counsel, a wiry man named David Kessler, shuffled papers nervously. His client, a woman in her late 20s, sat beside him, her eyes red-rimmed from tears or sleepless nights, perhaps both. On the right, the father's attorney, Margaret Doyle, leaned back with the calm confidence of someone used to winning arguments. Her client, a broad-shouldered man in his 30s, sat rigid, hands clasped tightly as if holding something. Inside, his jaw clenched whenever his eyes flickered toward his former partner, and more than once, the bailiff caught a flicker of cold anger pass across his face. The jurors filed in, each one carrying the unspoken awareness that their decision carried. More than legal weight, it carried human consequence. They were an ordinary mix, a teacher, a mechanic, a retiree, a young college student, and others. Some looked solemn, others uncertain, but all wore the same nervous awareness that no one wanted to misjudge when a child's safety hung in the balance. Yet, amid all this human tension, there was another presence, one that seemed almost out of place. Near the judge's bench, beside the bailiff, sat Officer Reynolds with his canine partner, a German shepherd named Ace. The dog was not there for theatrics. He had been trained to provide comfort and stability in courtrooms involving vulnerable victims, especially children. Many people overlooked him at first, dismissing him as another piece of background authority. But Ace was not idle. His golden eyes swept the room with quiet patience, his ears twitching to sounds others ignored. His chest rose and fell steadily, like a heartbeat that reassured anyone who noticed him. On one of the front benches sat the child at the center. Of this storm, a toddler, barely 3 years old. He clutched a soft toy tightly in his small hands, his legs too short to touch the floor from the bench where his guardian sat with him. His hair was tousled, his cheeks round, and his eyes darted about the room with wide, innocent curiosity. To him, this was not a courtroom, not a stage where adults argued over his future. It was just a strange, echoing room filled with serious faces and the quiet presence of a big dog he couldn't stop glancing at. The child's guardian, a middle-aged social worker named Patricia Lane, stroked the boy's back gently, whispering reassurance whenever he squirmed. She knew the stakes better than anyone. Reports had been filed, accusations made, counter-accusations thrown back. Yet so far, much of it was circumstantial, stitched together with shadows of truth and patches of doubt. Patricia had sat in many such hearings, but she felt a pit in her stomach for this one. Something didn't feel right, not with the case, and not with the man sitting stiffly across the aisle. Judge Carrington cleared her throat, her voice firm as she called the court to order. "This is the matter of custody for minor child Ethan James Carter," she announced, her tone even. "We will hear testimony and examine evidence. The welfare of the child remains the court's foremost priority." The room quieted further, as though the gravity of the judge's words sucked away even the restless shuffling of feet. "Attorney." Kessler rose first, presenting his opening remarks. His voice carried urgency, tinged with desperation. He spoke of neglect, of an unsafe environment, of nights where the toddler went without care. He gestured toward his client, the mother, who wiped tears from her cheeks. Jurors nodded slightly, sympathetic, though their expressions remained cautious. When Doyle stood to counter, her voice was smooth, practiced, and steady. She painted a different picture, a devoted father, unfairly accused, targeted by a bitter ex-partner. She reminded the jury that children need both parents, that assumptions could destroy families. As she spoke, her client nodded solemnly, his hands still clasped as if in prayer. The tug of war had begun. Evidence was passed, photographs displayed, testimonies read aloud. But for all the words, for all the carefully crafted arguments, a fog of uncertainty lingered. Nothing was definitive. Each piece of evidence seemed to contradict the last, each testimony balanced by its opposite. It was like trying to find truth in a hall of mirrors. Through it all, the toddler remained silent. He nestled closer to Patricia, his thumb occasionally slipping into his mouth. Every so often, his gaze would wander not toward the lawyers or even his parents, but toward the K9 lying calmly on the floor. Ace seemed to sense the attention, his tail thumping softly once before he resumed his quiet watch. For the people. In the gallery, time moved slowly. Minutes stretched into hours as legal arguments circled endlessly. Some spectators shifted uncomfortably on the hard benches. Others leaned forward, trying to catch every word. But beneath the surface, a subtle anticipation began to grow, an unspoken feeling that something unusual, something beyond ordinary courtroom procedure, was waiting to break through. The atmosphere thickened as witnesses were called. Neighbors testified about late-night arguments. A pediatric nurse spoke of visits that raised quiet concerns. Each testimony painted partial pictures, but none filled the canvas completely. Judge Carrington listened intently, occasionally scribbling notes, but her expression betrayed little. She was waiting, as they all were, for clarity to emerge. The defendant shifted in his seat more often now, his composure cracking at the edges. His attorney whispered to him between testimonies, urging calm. The mother, meanwhile, sat hunched, wringing tissues until they tore. In contrast, the child remained the still point around which all this turmoil swirled. His innocence was the silent weight pressing on everyone's conscience. By midday, tension had grown almost unbearable. The courtroom felt like a taut string, one wrong movement away from snapping. Even Ace seemed more alert now, his head lifting, eyes tracking the subtle unrest in the room. The bailiff glanced his way, then at the judge, uncertain but trusting. The animal's instincts. And in that heavy silence, as lawyers prepared for another round of questioning, no one could have guessed what was about to unfold. The quietest person in the room, the one everyone assumed was too young, too fragile, too innocent to contribute, was about to pierce the fog with words that would shatter everything. The courtroom atmosphere was not just tense, it was electric. Something unseen, yet inevitable, hovered in the air. And when it finally broke, it would change the course of the trial, the lives of everyone present, and the story that people would tell long after the gavel fell. The case that had drawn the community into Courtroom 3 was not a simple matter of two parents disagreeing about visitation schedules. At its heart was a haunting uncertainty. Was the child, Ethan James Carter, truly safe with his father? Or were the accusations against him fueled by bitterness and desperation? This question hovered over every testimony, every whispered conversation in the gallery, and every glance exchanged between lawyers. On paper, the case was straightforward. Ethan's mother, Rachel, had petitioned the court to limit or revoke the father's custodial rights, citing emotional neglect, erratic behavior, and suspected physical abuse. She claimed that Ethan came back from visits withdrawn, unusually quiet, sometimes flinching at sudden movements. There were no broken bones, no photographs of bruises that could not be explained by the rough-and-tumble world of toddlerhood. But to Rachel, the absence of visible proof didn't make her fears any less real. On the other side sat Daniel Carter, a father, a man who had built his reputation as a hard worker, a provider, someone who, to the outside world, seemed stable and reliable. He worked long hours as a construction foreman and was known among his colleagues as no-nonsense, disciplined, even charming at times. Yet those who looked closer sometimes noticed a temper beneath the surface, a flash in the eyes that appeared when he felt challenged. His attorney, Margaret Doyle, knew the case was winnable if she could keep the jury focused on the lack of concrete evidence. The lawyers, though professionals by trade, were just as entangled in the emotional weight of the case as their clients. David Kessler, representing Rachel, carried himself with urgency. He had seen too many cases where signs of abuse were missed until it was too late, where courts erred on the side of shared custody only for tragedy to follow. His goal wasn't just to win. He believed he was fighting for Ethan's safety. Margaret Doyle, on the other hand, believed just as strongly that Daniel was being painted unfairly. She had handled dozens of custody disputes where anger and revenge blurred the truth, and she was convinced this was one of them. The jury, caught in the middle, listened as the case unfolded piece by piece. First came the mother's testimony. Rachel's voice shook as she described Ethan's behavior after visits with Daniel. The nightmares, the sudden clinginess, the way he hid behind furniture when voices were raised. She admitted she had no physical proof, but argued that a mother's intuition could not be dismissed. "I know my child," she said through tears, clutching the tissue box placed on the stand. "Something happens when he's there. He's not the same when he comes back." Some jurors shifted uncomfortably in their seats. They could see her pain, feel the rawness in her voice. But others remained cautious. Emotion was not evidence, and courts required evidence to change lives. When it was Daniel's turn, he walked to the stand with steady steps, shoulders squared. He looked directly at the jury, his voice calm and measured. "I love my son more than anything in this world," he declared. He spoke of bedtime stories, of taking Ethan to the park, of teaching him how to kick a ball. He admitted that his work schedule was demanding, that he was sometimes tired or distracted, but insisted that he had never harmed his child. "These accusations," he said, voice tightening, "they come from anger, not truth. Rachel and we had a bad breakup. She's using Ethan to punish me." Margaret Doyle built on his testimony with practiced precision. She pointed to the lack of medical records, the absence of formal complaints filed with Child Protective Services before the custody petition. She reminded the jury that no neighbor, no teacher, no doctor had ever reported harm. "We cannot build verdicts on feelings," she said firmly. "We must build them on facts. And the facts here are thin." But then came the subtler evidence. A pediatric nurse testified about small, inconsistent bruises not alarming enough to report on their own, but noted across several visits. A neighbor recalled hearing loud arguments from Daniel's home late at night. A daycare worker mentioned that Ethan sometimes came in unusually quiet, clinging to his toy dog and refusing to speak for hours. Each account was small, fragmented, but together they formed a pattern Rachel's attorney emphasized with growing intensity. Abuse does not always leave scars we can see, Kessler reminded the jury. Sometimes it hides in silence, in fear too deep for a child to voice. We cannot wait for undeniable proof if it means risking a child's safety. The courtroom wrestled with every word. Spectators leaned forward, straining to catch the shifts in testimony. Some shook their heads in sympathy for Rachel. Others frowned, unconvinced. Reporters scribbled furiously, knowing the human drama unfolding before them was a story the town would devour. Through it all, Ethan remained the quiet center. Too young to testify, too small to grasp the words spoken about him, he sat with his guardian, thumb in his mouth, eyes flickering from face to face. At times he seemed restless, shifting in his seat, at others oddly focused, particularly when his father spoke. He never made a sound, never disrupted the proceedings, at least not yet. Ace, the K9, seemed equally attuned. He lay still, but his eyes followed the child often, as though sensing something others missed. Officer Reynolds kept one hand on the leash, though he hardly needed to. Ace had been trained for discipline. Still, the dog's ears would twitch whenever voices rose, and more than once he turned his head toward Daniel, fixing him with a gaze that made even the defendant look away. By the second day of testimony, the courtroom atmosphere had become more volatile. Rachel's friends filled the gallery, glaring openly at Daniel. His supporters sat on the opposite side, muttering about false accusations and parental alienation. The judge had already struck her gavel twice, warning the spectators to keep order. The case was becoming more than a custody hearing. It was becoming a battleground for loyalty, perception, and truth. The jury's burden grew heavier with every passing hour. They were not just deciding where Ethan would live. They were deciding whether his safety had already been compromised, whether his future held danger hidden beneath a parent's steady words. To make such a judgment based on partial truths was almost unbearable, yet it was the task before them. Still, the heart of the case remained unresolved. The mother's fears were vivid, but unproven. The father's denials were steady, but unshaken. By guilt, the lawyer's words clashed in rehearsed rhythms, but no decisive blow landed. It was as if the truth sat just out of reach, waiting for anyone to grasp it. And then there was the child, too small to understand custody, too innocent to manipulate, sitting quietly with his guardian. If he had words, if he could speak clearly, the case might find clarity. But Toddlers rarely spoke in ways courts could accept. His silence was the greatest void in the trial. That was until he broke it. No lawyer, no judge, no juror expected was that Ethan himself would shatter the uncertainty with the simplest gesture and the smallest words. And when that moment came, it would not arrive through formal testimony, evidence, or cross-examination. It would come suddenly, unpredictably, from the very heart of innocence. A case in question was never really about the parents, though they believed it was. It was about the child, his safety, his truth, his tiny voice waiting, however unconsciously, to be heard. And when that voice finally spoke, it would unravel everything carefully built in that courtroom. The courtroom had become a stage for words, lawyers' arguments, witnesses' testimonies, the judge's careful instructions. Yet, amid all the noise of voices, there was an undercurrent of silence that carried as much weight as any spoken statement. Silence lingered in the child, Ethan, who sat small and still beside his guardian on the front bench. His thumb brushed absently against the worn ear of his toy dog, a comfort he carried everywhere. He did not cry, did not fidget excessively, did not cause a disruption, the way most toddlers might when forced to sit through hours of adult proceedings. Instead, he watched. Wide, curious eyes followed people as they moved across the room, darted to the judge's gavel when it struck wood, and lingered often too often on his father. There was no malice in the boy's gaze, no conscious accusation. He was too young to wield such intentionality. But there was something in the way his body stiffened when his father's name was spoken, or how he leaned closer into the guardian when Daniel's voice rose in defense. Patricia Lane, the social worker assigned as his temporary guardian, noticed these small shifts. She was trained to notice such things, the subtle ways children communicate when they cannot or will not put words to their feelings. And every time Ethan pressed closer into her side, she felt her own conviction deepen. Patricia had worked cases like this before. She knew the burden of proof in a courtroom was high, perhaps too high when it came to protecting children. Too often she had seen the system demand visible evidence, a bruise, a broken bone, a report filed by a teacher before, believing a child might be unsafe. Yet children spoke in other ways, in silence, in nightmares, in sudden stillness when certain people entered the room. She had argued these points to judges before, sometimes with success, sometimes not. Today, she feared her observations would once again be dismissed as subjective impressions. Still, she held Ethan close and let her presence be steady, a silent reassurance that he was not alone in this storm. Just a few feet away, another silent observer lay on the polished wooden floor. Ace, the K9. At first glance, he looked entirely at ease, head resting on his paws, chest rising and falling in slow rhythm. But those who knew dogs well, particularly Officer Reynolds, recognized the signs of alertness beneath the calm. Ace's ears rotated slightly with each new voice. His nose twitched when tension in the room spiked. His eyes opened and closed, not in sleep, but in watchful rest. Ace had been trained for many roles: search and rescue, scent detection, and more recently, courtroom comfort work. Dogs like him were introduced into legal proceedings to ease the anxiety of children who were victims or witnesses, their presence often helping the youngest voices feel brave enough to speak. Though Ethan was not expected to testify, Ace's presence was intended as a stabilizing force, a silent anchor in the overwhelming storm of adult conflict. Yet, like Patricia, Ace seemed particularly attuned to the boy. Every time Ethan shifted in his seat, the dog's eyes flicked open. When the child's gaze landed on him, Ace would thump his tail once or lift his head briefly before lowering it again. It was a connection neither the judge nor the jury paid much attention to, but to Patricia, it was undeniable. The boy trusted the dog. The jurors, meanwhile, sat in their box with pens in hand and notebooks filled with fragmented details, times, dates, witness names, points made by each attorney. Their faces betrayed little, but their silence spoke volumes. Some leaned forward intently, eyebrows furrowed in concentration. Others scribbled without looking up. A few, however, allowed their eyes to wander, noticing the boy, the guardian, the dog. Their instructions were to weigh evidence, but even they could not help feeling the pull of unspoken moments. The way Ethan's silence carried a weight no testimony could match. Judge Carrington, too, was a silent observer in her own right. Though she asked questions when needed and kept the courtroom in order, she spent long stretches listening without expression, her sharp gaze scanning the faces before her. She had presided over many custody battles, knew the theater of emotion that came with them, knew that truth was often buried beneath layers of fear, anger, and performance. But she also knew children rarely lied, not at this age, not in ways that could so easily shift a trial's balance. The problem was, courts could not rely on gut feelings. They needed words, evidence, tangible proof. And as the judge looked at Ethan, so small and quiet, she felt a pang of frustration at the limits of the system she served. The silent observers were everywhere, then, not just the child and the dog, but the jurors weighing impressions they dared not voice, the judge who saw more than she could acknowledge, and even the spectators in the gallery. Many of them had their own silent judgments. Friends of Rachel whispered prayers beneath their breath, hoping the court would protect the child. Supporters of Daniel sat stiffly, their silence a shield against what they perceived as lies. Even the reporters, pens scratching quietly, observed with calculated neutrality, capturing details they would later spin into headlines. And in that silence, tension grew thicker. For hours, testimony continued. A daycare worker described Ethan's sudden withdrawal after weekends with his father. A neighbor recalled hearing shouts and thuds from Daniel's apartment, though she admitted she could not see what caused them. Each piece added to the mosaic, but none completed it. Doyle countered every claim with sharp precision, highlighting gaps, questioning motives, reminding the jury of the burden of proof. Kessler countered back, urging them not to dismiss patterns that pointed to danger. The battle of words continued, while the silent observers simply absorbed. What none of them realized, however, was that the silence was not passive. It was building toward something. Ethan, though quiet, was not unaffected. Every raised voice, every mention of his father's name, every shift of mood in the room registered in his small body. Patricia could feel it in the way he clutched his toy tighter, the way his eyes lingered on Ace, as though the dog were the only safe point in the room. Ace felt it too. Dogs had no need for legal arguments, no understanding of court procedures, but they understood energy. And the energy radiating from the boy was changing, shifting from stillness into something closer to resolve. Though no one could yet see it, the room's silence was deceptive. It looked like stillness, but it was more like the hush before. A storm breaks. Everyone waited, without realizing they were waiting, for something to cut through the fog of uncertainty. And when it came, it would not come from the lawyers, or the judge, or the witnesses sworn under oath. It would come from one of the smallest silent observers in the room, the one too many had assumed would remain voiceless. For now, though, the silence stretched on, heavy and telling. The boy sat still. The dog lay watchful. The jurors scribbled. The judge observed. And in that charged quiet, the fate of the case edged closer to a revelation no one could have anticipated. The silent observers were not just watching, they were waiting. The courtroom had settled into its familiar rhythm. A lawyer questioning, a witness responding, objections interrupting, the judge ruling. For those in attendance, it was the slow grind of justice, inching forward piece by piece. But beneath that rhythm was an almost imperceptible tension, a taut wire stretched across the room. Everyone felt it without quite knowing why. Something was waiting, something unscripted, something the gavel and procedure could not control. The smallest figure in the courtroom, the one most overlooked, was the first to feel the shift. Ethan sat quietly on the bench beside Patricia Lane, his guardian. He clutched his toy with one hand and pressed the other against Patricia's sleeve. His wide eyes had been following the voices, darting between the judge, the lawyers, and his parents. He had remained obediently still for hours, a surprising feat for a boy not yet 3 years old. But silence for a toddler is never endless. It is a pause, not permanence. Patricia felt it before anyone else. Ethan shifted restlessly against her side. She offered him the toy again, whispered reassurance in his ear, and smoothed his hair. But the boy seemed distracted, distant, as though his attention was fixed on something beyond her. His gaze had locked onto the figure at the defense table, his father. Daniel Carter sat with his shoulders tense, jaw tight, as his lawyer cross-examined yet another witness. His eyes flickered, occasionally toward his son, though the look was brief, unreadable. Perhaps it was longing, perhaps it was irritation. No one could say. But to Ethan, something in that presence stirred unease too strong to ignore. Patricia leaned down and whispered, "It's all right, sweetheart. Just a little longer." But Ethan did not respond. His small body stiffened, as if the air around him had suddenly grown heavy. Then, with a surprising burst of determination, he wriggled free from Patricia's arm and slid off the bench. The sound of his shoes against the wooden floor was tiny, almost delicate, yet in the hushed courtroom, it echoed like a drumbeat. Every head turned. The attorney paused mid-question. The witness froze, uncertain whether to continue. "Ethan," Patricia whispered urgently, reaching out to catch him. But the boy moved with unexpected speed, toddling forward with short, determined steps. The courtroom's stillness shattered into murmurs. Spectators leaned forward, startled, unsure if this was allowed. The bailiff instinctively stepped forward, but halted at the judge's subtle shake of her head. Judge Carrington's sharp eyes softened, watching closely. She sensed the gravity of the moment, and chose not to intervene. Ethan's steps echoed as he crossed the open space at the center of the courtroom. His toy dropped from his grasp, forgotten. He walked with purpose that seemed too sure for his age, as though some inner compass pulled him forward. Then he stopped. Every gaze followed him, breath collectively held. He stood still, small against the vastness of the courtroom, his head tilted up, eyes wide, his little hand slowly lifted. At first, everyone thought he was pointing at the K9. Ace, lying obediently by Officer Reynolds, lifted his head. The German shepherd's ears pricked forward, eyes locking on the child. His tail thunked once, a soft sound against the floor, as though acknowledging the boy's gesture. A wave of uneasy laughter rippled through the gallery, quickly silenced by the judge's gavel. "Order," Judge Carrington commanded, though her voice carried less reprimand than restraint. She, too, was waiting, but Ethan's gaze did not linger on the dog. His arm wavered slightly, then steadied, extending. Past the K9, past Officer Reynolds. His small finger pointed straight toward the defense table, straight at his father. The silence that followed was heavier than any gavel strike. Daniel froze, his face paling, his jaw slackening as his son's eyes locked onto his. For a moment, he seemed stripped of his composure, exposed under the unblinking gaze of a child who had no concept of legal arguments, no understanding of courtroom tactics. "Ethan," Patricia called softly, her voice breaking the spell. She hurried forward, ready to scoop him back into safety. But before she could reach him, the boy spoke. His voice was tiny, trembling, almost uncertain, yet it carried through the room like a bell ringing in still air. 2 words. And though those words belonged to part 6 of the story, the seed of them was planted here, in the unexpected movement, in the child's sudden decision to rise from silence. For now, the courtroom reacted only to the act itself, the boy standing, pointing, declaring something without yet declaring it. The gallery erupted into murmurs again, this time louder, confused, unsettled. Jurors exchanged glances, their pens. Forgotten. One juror, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, placed a hand over her mouth, her expression caught between shock and sorrow. Ace barked once, just once. A sharp, startling sound that cut through the whispers like a blade. Officer Reynolds tightened his grip on the leash, but the dog did not lunge, did not growl. He simply stared where the boy pointed, as though he, too, understood. Judge Carrington's gavel slammed down. Order. This courtroom will come to order. But even as the echoes of wood on wood filled the chamber, no one could shake the sight of the child standing in the center of the room, pointing with a clarity beyond his years. Patricia finally reached him, kneeling and pulling him gently back into her arms. She whispered soothing words, stroking his hair. But Ethan did not resist. His little hand remained outstretched for a moment longer, trembling in the air before slowly lowering back to his side. The judge's eyes softened, just briefly, before she regained her steel composure. "We will take a recess," she declared, firmly striking the gavel again. "Court will reconvene in 30 minutes. The bailiff called the room to rise as the judge exited, but the order felt hollow. The room buzzed with shock, with speculation, with the unspoken understanding that something monumental had just occurred. Daniel sat rigid, his eyes fixed on the table before him, his lawyer whispering frantically at his side. Rachel sat across the aisle, tears spilling freely, her hands pressed against her mouth. The jurors filed out, whispering in hushed tones they would later be instructed to ignore. The reporters scribbled furiously, knowing they had witnessed a moment that would fill tomorrow's headlines. But at the center of it all was Ethan, cradled now in Patricia's arms. He leaned his head against her shoulder, his small frame trembling. He did not understand the shock he had caused, nor the weight of what was to come. To him, it was simple. He had pointed where he needed to point. Ace lowered his head back to his paws, silent again, but his eyes never left the boy. The unexpected movement had broken the silence. The courtroom would not return to what it was before. And though the boy's words had not yet been spoken, every soul in the room understood. The trial had shifted. The unexpected had arrived, and with it, the truth was drawing closer. The courtroom had not yet fully recovered from the shock of the toddler's unexpected movement. Patrons whispered nervously, attorneys adjusted in their seats, and jurors leaned forward, pens momentarily forgotten. For a brief moment, the child's tiny hand outstretched, finger pointing, suspended the room in an almost unbearable stillness. Ethan remained steady, standing on his short legs, cradled loosely by Patricia Lane. His gaze had locked on his father, wide eyes unblinking, revealing more comprehension than anyone dared assume a 3-year-old could possess. It was not just a look of curiosity. It was accusation, understanding, and unfiltered truth. The innocence of youth collided with the weight of reality, and every adult present felt it. Ace, the K9, lifted his head fully now, ears swiveling toward the boy. The dog's gaze was unwavering, focused entirely on the defendant. Daniel Carter, as though he too recognized a subtle tension that humans might have missed. His tail thumped once, a sound that resonated unnervingly in the hushed courtroom. Officer Reynolds maintained a firm hand on the leash, though the dog had no intention of moving violently. It was a signal, a canine acknowledgement that the child's gesture carried meaning beyond mere randomness. The jurors leaned forward in their seats, exchanging furtive glances. Their notebooks were ignored, their pens suspended in mid-air. One middle-aged juror, a retired nurse, whispered under her breath, He's pointing at him." Another, a young college student, gripped the edge of the bench, pale with disbelief. All of them could feel the gravity of a tiny finger, wielding truth in a room designed for reason and law. Judge Carrington, though trained to maintain impartiality, could not entirely mask the curiosity in her eyes. Her gaze flickered between the child, the dog, and Daniel. She was fully aware that nothing in legal procedure accounted for this moment, that no rules could direct how adults should interpret a toddler's unspoken declaration. Her gavel, which had been repeatedly used to restore order moments earlier, remained idle. Even she was waiting. The spectators in the gallery pressed closer to the railing, craning their necks. Cameras clicked quietly, capturing what no one had anticipated: a 3-year-old standing, unassisted, pointing directly at the defendant. Some murmured nervously. One elderly woman gasped audibly and covered her mouth. "He knows," she whispered. "The child knows." Daniel Carter's reaction was instantaneous. His posture stiffened, muscles tensing as if bracing for an unseen blow. He shifted uncomfortably in his seat, hands clenched into fists on the table before him. His eyes darted between the boy and his attorney, then back again, his composure fracturing just enough to betray his anxiety. Margaret Doyle leaned forward, whispering reassurances, but even she could not mask the tension spreading across the defense table. Rachel Carter, sitting on the opposite side, let out a quiet, almost imperceptible sigh of relief. Her hands shook slightly as she clutched the tissue box, tears brimming. For the first time in days of testimony, she felt a glimmer of vindication. The child's gesture validated the fears she had struggled to articulate in a courtroom designed for words, not silent truths. Patricia Lane, kneeling beside the child, whispered softly to him, stroking his hair. "It's okay, sweetheart. Just a little longer." She could feel the boy's tension radiating through his tiny body. His finger did not waver. He was steadfast, pointing with a certainty that defied his age. Patricia had never witnessed a child so young display such deliberate focus, and she sensed instinctively that this moment was monumental. Ace shifted slightly, keeping his head raised, gaze unwavering. The German shepherd's awareness seemed to amplify the tension, his silent presence reinforcing the power of the child's action. There was a profound communication occurring in that silent exchange, a child pointing, the dog watching, the father frozen. Even those unfamiliar with canine behavior could sense the importance. The courtroom remained completely still. Even lawyers paused mid-sentence, caught in a liminal moment where argument and objection could not compete with the immediacy of observation. Every adult in the room felt the weight of the tiny finger its accusation, its unspoken narrative, and the quiet clarity it carried. A court reporter scribbled furiously, trying to capture the moment, but even words seemed inadequate. How could one describe a child's gesture that held the potential to alter the course of a legal battle? Every scribbled note felt insufficient to the magnitude of the scene. Daniel shifted in his seat again, voice finally breaking the silence. What is he doing?" he asked, voice tight, almost incredulous. Margaret Doyle responded quickly, attempting to calm both the defendant and the room. "He's a toddler," she said, her voice firm. "He does not understand what he's doing. Let's not read into it." But even she could feel it. The room had changed. Something fundamental had shifted. The child's gesture could not be ignored, dismissed, or rationalized away. Every glance, every heartbeat, seemed to align with the pointing finger. The judge's gavel struck the desk lightly, not to restore order, but to regain attention. All parties remain calm. "We will allow the child to settle. No one is to interfere." Her tone was measured, but carried authority. She knew the moment was delicate, and she allowed it to unfold with as little disruption as possible. Ethan remained steadfast. His finger did not quiver. He was small, but the force of his action seemed to reverberate across the courtroom, seeping into the minds of adults who had been debating, analyzing, and strategizing for hours. In that instant, the child's presence was the focal point of truth. The murmurs in the gallery grew louder, yet no one dared speak too loudly. It was as if the room collectively understood. This gesture was not just a moment of curiosity, but a prelude to revelation. Ace barked again, softly this time, almost affirming the significance of the pointing finger. Officer Reynolds tightened his hold on the leash, aware that even a small movement from the dog now could heighten the already tense environment. Yet Ace remained calm, signaling an awareness of the gravity rather than contributing to chaos. Jurors scribbled notes frantically. Some tried to describe the boy's stance, the way his finger extended, the intent in his eyes. Others simply stopped writing, overwhelmed by the raw immediacy of the scene. One juror, a young teacher, whispered to another, "It's like he's telling the truth without words." The second juror nodded, equally stunned. Rachel Carter's hands gripped the edge of the bench. She swallowed hard, trying to steady her breathing. She had feared her child might be too young, too quiet, too powerless in the courtroom. But here, standing, pointing, Ethan was asserting something undeniable. Daniel Carter's jaw tightened. Further, his eyes darted repeatedly between Ethan and his attorney, searching for guidance, searching for a way to refute what he could not yet even articulate. His professional composure faltered under the intensity of the child's gesture. Judge Carrington observed silently, her sharp gaze encompassing all that occurred. She knew this was unprecedented, no legal precedent covered a child's nonverbal gesture interpreted in this manner. Yet she also understood that in a courtroom focused on justice, such moments of clarity could not simply be ignored. Patricia, still holding Ethan, whispered again, soothingly. She felt the boy's determination radiating through him. This was not mere childish curiosity. It was a statement, a communication that demanded attention. She could not explain it, but she knew instinctively that it was true. The courtroom seemed frozen in time. Each silent observer child, dog, jurors, judge, and spectators held their place, caught in the gravity of the pointing finger. The air was electric, thick with anticipation. Something was about to happen, something that would break the fragile equilibrium of the trial, something that would bring clarity no testimony had yet delivered. And all eyes remained fixed on the child, on the tiny hand stretched forward, unwavering, pointing toward a truth that no one could yet fully articulate. The courtroom had been suspended in a strange, almost unbearable silence. Every adult present felt the weight of the tiny finger pointed toward Daniel Carter, the defendant. The jurors leaned forward, pens dropped mid-sentence, witnesses paused, mid-thought, and lawyers exchanged hurried, uneasy glances. For what felt like an eternity, no one spoke. All eyes were fixed on Ethan, the boy at the center of the storm, held gently by his guardian, Patricia Lane. Then, without warning, the boy's lips parted, and a voice so small, so fragile, yet impossibly clear, rose into the tense air. "Bad man." 2 words, almost lost amid the silence, yet they rang louder than any objection, louder than any witness testimony. The effect was immediate. Gasps erupted from the spectators. Rachel Carter's hands flew to her mouth as tears welled in her eyes. She whispered a prayer, scarcely believing what she had just heard. Across the aisle, Daniel Carter froze entirely, his jaw slack, his face draining of color. For the first time in the trial, his veneer of control faltered completely. Ace, the K9, barked sharply once, almost in affirmation. The sound seemed synchronized with the toddler's declaration, as though the dog recognized the truth embedded in the boy's simple words. Officer Reynolds' hand tightened on the leash, the sound jolting him into full awareness of the gravity of the moment. The judge, Helen Carrington, struck her gavel sharply, though her voice betrayed more awe than authority this time. "Order! Order in the courtroom!" she commanded, but the words felt almost secondary. Even she had been struck by the clarity in that tiny voice, a clarity that no adult argument had yet produced. Jurors leaned forward, eyes wide, pens forgotten. They scribbled rapidly, trying to capture the raw emotional truth that had erupted in front of them. One juror, a retired nurse, whispered to herself, "It's him. He's saying it." Another juror, a young teacher, shook her head slightly, disbelief etched into her expression. They had been trained to analyze testimony rationally, but logic had suddenly collided with innocence in a way they could not ignore. Rachel Carter's face glowed with relief. She had feared that the courtroom would dismiss her concerns, that the fragmented evidence, the conflicting testimonies, and the calculated arguments would bury the truth of her child's experience. Yet here it was, spoken plainly, unadorned. Uncoached, Ethan's voice, tiny yet indelible, declaring what he felt with uncompromising honesty. Daniel Carter's eyes darted between his son and his attorney, Margaret Doyle, panic and disbelief flashing across his face. This is ridiculous, he stammered, his voice tight, barely a whisper. A child cannot say that. He doesn't understand. Doyle leaned forward, whispering reassurances, yet even she could not mask her own unease. The courtroom had shifted, and the rules of engagement no longer felt adequate. The child's declaration had broken through every carefully constructed argument, piercing the procedural walls that attorneys had spent hours erecting. The gallery buzzed with murmurs. Spectators exchanged astonished looks. Cameras clicked silently, reporters scribbled frantically, and even those who had been skeptical of Rachel's claims now looked at her son with a new sense of recognition. The room seemed to breathe differently, heavier and yet electrified. Every movement and word now colored by the toddler's statement. Patricia Lane, kneeling beside Ethan, whispered softly, stroking his hair and holding him close. "It's okay, sweetheart. You did the right thing." She could feel the trembling in his tiny body, the mixture of fear and resolve that had driven him to speak. The boy's wide eyes scanned the room, taking in every face, every expression, unaware of the seismic shift he had caused. The judge called for a recess, attempting to restore order and process the unprecedented moment. "Court will reconvene in 30 minutes, she said, gavel striking decisively. "We will ensure all parties remain calm. The jury may step outside for deliberation." But even as the courtroom emptied, the echoes of Ethan's words lingered. The silence after his declaration was filled with a weight that no argument could erase. Lawyers conferred hurriedly, strategizing how to respond to a child's testimony that existed outside the traditional framework of evidence. Investigators glanced at each other, reconsidering details they had previously dismissed. Even the jurors, stepping out to the hallway, could not stop whispering about what had just occurred. Daniel Carter sat frozen, shaking his head. He opened his mouth to speak, then closed it, staring at the spot where his son had stood. His carefully maintained composure had shattered. He had relied on reason, on facts, on procedural certainty. But now, in the face of a child's unfiltered truth, those tools felt inadequate. Rachel Carter embraced her relief privately, tears streaming freely. She whispered prayers of gratitude, her emotions a mixture of validation, fear, and hope. For months, she had worried, agonized, and fought to protect her son. And now, the child himself had spoken, articulating what her instincts had known all along. Ace remained alert, his head raised, ears swiveling slightly as if sensing the human emotions swirling around him. The dog's awareness, combined with the child's words, created an almost palpable tension that seemed to vibrate through the air. Officer Reynolds kept his hand firm on the leash, understanding instinctively that the courtroom had witnessed an extraordinary event, one that defied expectation, procedure, and precedent. When the court reconvened, the atmosphere had shifted irreversibly. Lawyers approached their tables with caution. The jury leaned forward with heightened focus. And every observer in the room felt that the trial had changed. Ethan's words had clarified what no other testimony had: the emotional reality of the child, his fear, and the truth he could express in only two simple, shattering words. Kessler, Rachel's attorney, addressed the court carefully. "Your Honor, we believe this moment underscores the child's distress and validates the need for protective measures. While he is not formally testifying, his actions and words reflect genuine fear and an urgent need for attention." Doyle countered cautiously, trying to maintain the integrity of the defense. "Your Honor, we recognize the child's statement, but urged the court to consider the limitations of his understanding. He is, after all, a toddler and may not grasp the full context. Judge Carrington weighed both sides with the impartiality she had cultivated over decades. Yet even her trained mind could not ignore the profound significance of a child's spoken truth, particularly when reinforced by the silent communication between boy and dog, the unwavering gestures, and the expressions of everyone in the room. The jurors, though instructed to deliberate based on evidence, could not erase the weight of the declaration. It had entered the room not as testimony to be analyzed, but as undeniable truth conveyed through innocence and courage. Rachel Carter's relief was tempered by anxiety. She knew the legal system would still require formal proceedings, careful deliberation, and corroborating evidence. Yet in her heart, she felt that Ethan's voice had cut through the uncertainty in a way no court record could. Daniel Carter's face remained pale. For the first time, he looked uncertain, exposed by the raw honesty of a child who had no strategy, no motive, and no ability to manipulate perception. The two words had struck a chord deeper than logic, bypassing arguments and evidence, leaving only human instinct to interpret their meaning. Patricia Lane held Ethan, brushing a stray lock of hair from his eyes. "You were very brave," she whispered, more to herself than to him. She could feel the gravity of the moment settling over the room like a heavy cloak. She had witnessed children in court before, but rarely had a child's actions, and now words so directly impacted the trajectory of a case. Ace shifted slightly, but remained seated, eyes still trained on the boy. The dog had been silent for much of the morning, but the brief bark, the attentive posture, and the unwavering gaze now reinforced the child's statement in an almost mystical way. For those who believed in signs, it was affirmation. For those who did not, it was a reminder that some truths transcend words. Even as the courtroom processed what had happened, one thing was certain: nothing would ever be the same. The trial had taken an unexpected turn, and the child, so small and seemingly powerless, had become the pivot upon which the entire proceeding now balanced. Ethan, unaware of the magnitude of his declaration, snuggled into Patricia's arms, his wide eyes scanning the room again. He had spoken the truth as he felt it, and in doing so, had forced every adult in the courtroom to confront realities they could not deny. And in that moment, the room, the trial, and everyone within it understood a profound truth. Sometimes the smallest voices carry the greatest weight. The courtroom had descended into a surreal blend of stunned silence and murmured commentary after Ethan's tiny but explosive declaration. "Bad man?" The words had pierced the procedural armor of legal formalities, reverberating in the hearts and minds of everyone present. They were not just words. They were a verdict of innocence and danger, expressed by the purest voice of all. Rachel Carter sat rigid in her seat, hands trembling as she gripped her tissues. Tears ran freely down her cheeks, not from triumph, but from a mixture of relief, disbelief, and overwhelming gratitude. Her son, so small and fragile, had spoken when words alone could not have carried the truth. She whispered softly to herself, "He's safe now. He's safe." Yet even in this fleeting comfort, her mind raced ahead, thinking of the legal implications, the challenges that would still lie ahead. Daniel Carter, on the other hand, was frozen in disbelief. The room seemed to tilt beneath him as though the entire weight of reality had shifted. His carefully cultivated composure, his reliance on procedural rules and formal argumentation, had been undone in an instant. He looked at his attorney, Margaret Doyle, as if seeking guidance, reassurance, or a lifeline. Doyle, however skilled and experienced, could only respond with a quiet acknowledgement of the severity of the moment. Even she was unprepared for the far emotional impact of a child's raw honesty puncturing the courtroom's controlled environment. Ace, the K9, remained a silent observer, his posture alert, head raised, eyes unwavering. The dog's presence seemed almost symbolic, a living testament to the weight of innocence, protection, and instinct. Officer Reynolds kept a firm hand on the leash, his gaze fixed on the boy. He had witnessed children in court before, but he had never seen one so young affect the trajectory of proceedings through pure, unfiltered courage. The jurors were visibly shaken. A retired nurse, seated toward the front, whispered to herself, I've never seen anything like this." A young teacher juror, notebook abandoned on her lap, shook her head in disbelief. Even seasoned citizens trained to analyze evidence methodically felt themselves affected by something that transcended logic. A toddler's words could not be quantified, measured, or objectified, but the truth in them was undeniable. Judge Helen Carrington maintained her professionalism, though her expression softened with subtle recognition of the moment's gravity. She had presided over decades of legal proceedings, yet she knew instinctively that this case had transcended ordinary parameters. The judicial system relied on evidence, testimony, and procedural fairness, but occasionally, truth arrived in forms that defied convention. Today, that truth had arrived through a child too young to testify formally, too innocent to deceive. After a brief recess, court reconvened, but the atmosphere had changed irreversibly. The attorneys approached their tables cautiously. Kessler, Rachel's lawyer, spoke first, his tone measured but heavy with significance. "Your Honor, we believe the child's statement, while informal, demonstrates his genuine distress and need for protection. It underscores the seriousness of the allegations," Margaret Doyle countered carefully. "Your Honor, while we respect the child's expression, we must remind the court that he is only a toddler. His understanding is limited, and his words cannot substitute for formal testimony or evidence. We ask that the court consider this in the context of due process." The judge listened intently, balancing empathy with procedural rigor. She was acutely aware that her decisions could reshape a life, and she could not ignore the weight of a child's declaration, no matter how unconventional the form. Outside the courtroom, the gallery buzzed with whispers. Spectators exchanged interpretations of the moment, debating what it meant, who it implicated, and how it would influence the case. Reporters scribbled furiously, capturing every nuance, aware that this story would dominate local headlines. Some murmured admiration for the child's courage. Others expressed sympathy for the difficulty of the legal system in reconciling instinct and procedure. Back in the courtroom, the jurors began deliberations. Their discussions were heated and emotional, yet tinged with awe. "He's so young," one juror said, voice trembling. "But the way he said it, it's as if he's been holding it inside for months." Another countered, "We still have to weigh the evidence, but his words, they carry a truth we cannot ignore." The child's declaration had provided an emotional lens through which all evidence would now be interpreted, coloring perception and judgment. Daniel Carter's face was pale as he whispered to his attorney, "This isn't fair. A child cannot decide my fate." Doyle responded quietly, attempting to frame the situation legally. "We will navigate it carefully. Focus on the facts, not the emotions." But even she knew that emotions had already infiltrated every corner of the room. The child's words had punctured the clinical walls of legality, leaving humanity exposed. Meanwhile, Rachel Carter struggled to steady her emotions. She had feared that no one would believe her concerns, that the fragments of observations from daycare workers, neighbors, and herself would be dismissed as paranoia. Now her son had spoken, validating her instincts in a way that formal evidence could not replicate. Each tear she shed carried relief, gratitude, and a lingering fear. What if the system, despite this declaration, still failed to act decisively? Patricia Lane remained vigilant, holding Ethan close. She could feel the tremor in his body, the residual tension from the earlier confrontation. "It's okay," she whispered softly. "You were brave. You've been heard." The boy nestled into her arms, unaware of the impact his words had caused, yet instinctively understanding that something important had shifted. Ace, ever watchful, shifted slightly, but remained seated. The dog's calm presence provided continuity and reassurance, a reminder that protection and understanding were not confined to human perception alone. Officer Reynolds adjusted the leash, silently acknowledging that the moment had transcended. Ordinary courtroom experience. As deliberations continued, lawyers adjusted their strategies, jurors debated every nuance, and the judge considered the broader implications. The child's 2 words were now a central reference point, shaping questions, testimonies, and interpretations. Arguments were no longer solely about circumstantial evidence. They now had to account for a living, breathing assertion of truth, delivered in its purest form. The trial, once proceeding along predictable lines, had become something unprecedented. A confrontation between legal procedure and instinctual truth. Every participant, from attorneys to jurors to spectators, felt the shift. The balance of justice was no longer dictated purely by evidence. It was intertwined with courage, innocence, and the undeniable clarity of a toddler's voice. For Daniel Carter, the emotional shock was compounded by strategic uncertainty. The defendant had relied on reason, procedure, and formal argumentation. He had assumed that appearances, logic, and evidence would shield him from accusation. But the child's statement rendered those assumptions fragile. His world, carefully constructed around control and composure, had been disrupted by a voice too young to be constrained by legal conventions. Rachel Carter, conversely, experienced a profound sense of validation. Her instincts had been correct. Her fears had been real. And now, in the most unexpected form, her son had spoken what she could not have articulated alone. The courtroom had heard it. The jurors had heard it. Even the defendant could not ignore it. By the end of the day, the courtroom had undergone a transformation. It was no longer a neutral arena of argumentation. It was a chamber marked by emotional resonance, by the weight of innocence asserting itself over technicality. Every participant understood that this moment would shape not only the outcome of the trial, but also the emotional landscape of everyone involved. The reverberations of Ethan's declaration extended beyond the courtroom. Outside, whispers spread through the town. Neighbors discussed the extraordinary courage of a 3-year-old. Friends and family shared astonishment at the simplicity and potency of his words. The legal community, too, would later reflect on the unprecedented influence of a child's direct expression in a courtroom setting. And at the center of it all, Ethan remained unaware of the chaos and deliberation swirling around him. He had said what he felt. He had pointed with certainty. And in doing so, he had shifted the course of the trial, the lives of his parents, and the understanding of every adult present. For all the formalities of law, the procedural arguments, and the weighty deliberations, one truth had emerged with unassailable clarity. Sometimes, the smallest voices carry the greatest power, and innocence can speak more truth than any lawyer, witness, or document. The courtroom had never been the same since the moment Ethan spoke those 2 tiny words. Bad man. They had rippled through the room like a shockwave, leaving stunned silence, whispered speculation, and a profound shift in perception. Now, after hours of deliberation and reflection, the focus had returned to the judge's bench, where the gravity of the case demanded closure. Judge Helen Carrington leaned forward, her gaze sweeping the room. She had spent decades in the courtroom, weighing evidence, balancing arguments, and adjudicating conflicts. Yet rarely had she encountered a situation that transcended the procedural confines of law. Today, Innocence had spoken, and its voice could not be ignored. Rachel Carter sat in the front row, hands clasped tightly together. The tension of the trial, the sleepless nights worrying for her son's safety, and the emotional roller coaster of the past week weighed heavily on her shoulders. Her relief was palpable, though tinged with lingering anxiety. She knew that even with the child's declaration, the court's decision would carry complexities and repercussions. Daniel Carter, meanwhile, remained pale and taut, his professional composure replaced by a mixture of disbelief and growing apprehension. His attorney, Margaret Doyle, whispered quietly, attempting to remind him of the procedural safeguards and the need for careful navigation. But even she recognized the enormity of the challenge. A child's declaration, reinforced by gesture and instinct, had altered the narrative irreversibly. The jurors filed back into the courtroom, notebooks in hand, their expressions somber, yet alert. They had deliberated for hours, weighing testimony, reviewing evidence, and grappling with the emotional weight of the toddler's words. Though instructed to consider evidence in a measured, logical fashion, they could not erase the undeniable impression made by a 3-year-old's unfiltered honesty. Foremost in their minds was the point, the gesture, and the words. Every other piece of testimony, the neighbor's recollections, the daycare observations, the sporadic inconsistencies, had taken on new meaning when considered alongside the child's declaration. The toddler had spoken truth in a form unencumbered by strategy or fear. Judge Carrington called the court to order. Her voice, firm but empathetic, carried across the chamber. We have received the jury's recommendations and have reviewed the evidence, both formal and informal. This court recognizes the extraordinary circumstances surrounding the testimony, as unusual as they may be, and has carefully considered the welfare of the child above all else. Rachel held her breath, clutching the tissue box, tears threatening to spill once again. Her entire being was focused on the outcome, knowing that it would define the safety and future of her son. The judge continued, "The court finds that, given the totality of circumstances, a child's safety and well-being must take precedence. Custody shall remain primarily with the mother, Rachel Carter, with carefully supervised visitation for the father, Daniel Carter, under the guidance of a licensed child welfare officer. Any unsupervised contact is deferred until a thorough behavioral assessment is conducted." A quiet exhale swept through the courtroom. Rachel's shoulders relaxed, and tears of relief flowed freely. She whispered softly, almost reverently, "Thank you. Thank you, Ethan." Her son sat in Patricia's arms, unaware of the monumental role he had played in securing this outcome, but secure in the warmth and safety of his mother's presence. Daniel Carter's face fell. The decision, though measured, was a clear admonition. The court had recognized the weight of his child's actions and words. He nodded stiffly, accepting the ruling, though frustration and disbelief lingered in his expression. Margaret Doyle quietly conferred with him, outlining the next steps for supervised visitation and the mandated assessment. Ace, the K-9, remained, seated near Officer Reynolds, head tilted slightly, ears alert. The dog's presence had been pivotal in providing comfort and stability to Ethan throughout the proceedings. Though silent and non-judgmental, Ace's calm vigilance had underscored the significance of the child's actions, reinforcing the impression that safety and instinct often speak louder than argumentation. Patricia Lane held Ethan close, stroking his hair and murmuring reassurance. "You were brave, sweetheart," she whispered. "You helped everyone understand." Ethan's wide eyes looked up at her, still innocent, still unaware of the magnitude of his impact. To him, the courtroom was simply a place of noise and strange adults, but his courage had spoken volumes. Outside the courtroom, the atmosphere was electric. Spectators, reporters, and even members of the local community had gathered, waiting for updates. News of a toddler altering the course of a custody case spread quickly, capturing hearts and sparking discussions about parental responsibility, child advocacy, and the extraordinary power of innocence. Reporters interviewed both parties, though Rachel declined most commentary, choosing instead to focus on Ethan. "We're just grateful he's safe," she said softly, holding her son tightly. "That's all that matters." Daniel Carter issued a brief statement, carefully measured, asserting that he intended to comply with the court's ruling and pursue supervised visitation as prescribed. In the weeks that followed, the aftermath of the trial rippled through the lives of everyone involved. Rachel focused on building a nurturing environment for Ethan, supported by family, friends, and the community. She enrolled him in programs designed to help children process experiences of stress and uncertainty, while ensuring that his daily life remained as stable and joyful as possible. Daniel began the process of supervised visitation, attending court-mandated assessments and parenting classes. Though bruised emotionally and publicly, he committed to following the guidelines, hoping to rebuild trust and demonstrate his capacity for safe interaction with his son. Over time, he learned that control and authority in parenting required patience, empathy, and accountability. Patricia Lane continued her role as guardian and advocate, monitoring Ethan's well-being and providing guidance to Rachel. She praised his courage privately, emphasizing the importance of speaking truth in whatever form it could be expressed. "Sometimes words aren't necessary," she told Rachel. "Actions, gestures, and even small declarations can change everything." Ace returned to his usual duties, but the bond formed between the dog and Ethan remained remarkable. Every interaction, every gesture reinforced the child's confidence and security. The quiet presence of a loyal companion had proven invaluable in helping Ethan navigate the overwhelming stress of a courtroom filled with adult complexities. Community members reflected on the case for months afterward, often remarking on the extraordinary circumstances. Social workers and legal professionals debated the influence of nonverbal communication, the weight of toddler testimony, and the role of instinct in determining child safety. Scholars cited the case as an example of how innocence, courage, and the careful observation of subtle cues could impact legal outcomes. For Ethan, life gradually returned to the rhythm of early childhood playgrounds, storybooks, and bedtime routines, but the shadow of the courtroom and its lessons lingered subtly in his world. He had spoken, acted, and been heard, even without fully understanding the implications of his words. His bravery had been a catalyst, a reminder that truth often arrives in forms beyond expectation, and that the smallest voices can carry the greatest weight. A family, though scarred by the ordeal, emerged stronger. Rachel's vigilance and advocacy were validated. Daniel's awareness of accountability grew, and the broader community was reminded that justice is not only a matter of evidence and procedure, it is also a matter of humanity, courage, and listening when those without power find their voice. And for everyone who had witnessed it, one lesson became clear. Sometimes, the smallest beings, the quietest gestures, and the simplest words can reshape the course of lives. Ethan's 2 words had done precisely that, creating a ripple that extended far beyond the walls of the courtroom into hearts, minds, and a community forever changed. The story, though extraordinary, ended simply. A toddler pointed, a canine observed, adults listened, and justice imperfect, human, but ultimately compassionate, found its course. And in the quiet aftermath, Ethan slept soundly, safe at last, in the embrace of the people who loved him most.